to... good. Okay. Okay, well, can I give a warm welcome to everyone at this annual Political Quarterly Lecture. I've got a few announcements to make first before I introduce our speaker for this evening. First of all, I'm asked to tell you that there's a special issue of Political Quarterly available at the moment, available free. It's a special issue devoted to UKIP, and it's, I'm afraid, without a foreword by Nigel Farage, but it's available until the end of November free. So if you want to pick that up, please do. Today is Leonard Woolf's birthday. Leonard Woolf was one of the founders and long-serving editors of the Political Quarterly, and we've made free 12 of his well-known articles written for PQ. So if you go to the PQ website, you can have a look at those. There are online subscriptions at £10 for 2015 for PQ. So anyone who wants to subscribe can get a subscription for the whole year for £10. And there will be a podcast of this lecture available later. I'm also to say that if anyone who wants to tweet, it's hashtag Ginsborg. So, to the main business of the evening, it's a great pleasure to me to be able to introduce Paul Ginsborg. Paul is Professor of Contemporary History at Florence since 1992. Before that, he was a reader in European politics at Cambridge. He has had a very distinguished academic career and also a career as a major public intellectual. He's made a significant contribution to Italian public life. He was part of the Rivolta dei Professori in 2001-2, attacking the policies of the Berlusconi government towards the judiciary. And he's made many other interventions in Italian politics. He was, amongst many distinctions in his career, he was awarded the Serena Medal for Italian Studies by the British Academy in 2006. His books are many, and they've been translated into many different languages, I think at least 12 languages. One of the first was Daniel Manin and the Venetian Revolution of 1848-9. He's also published A History of Contemporary Italy, Italy and Its Discontents, 1980 to 2001, Berlusconi, which was which for a time topped the non-fiction bestseller lists in Italy, The Politics of Everyday Life, Democracy, and most recently of all, just published by Yale University Press, Family Politics, Domestic Life, Devastation and Survival, 1900 to 1950. That has just been published. There are copies available outside if you'd like to have a look at one and purchase one. So you can see that Paul has had a most distinguished and prolific and active career. I can't think of anyone better to talk to us about Italian politics. The title of his talk tonight is Recent Italian Politics in Historical Perspective. Paul. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation from Political Quarterly. It's a great honor to give the annual lecture.
I'm going to talk for about 45 to 50 minutes and then throw it open for questions. I'm extremely pleased to see so many students here, and I hope they'll feel like speaking. Well, whichever way one looks at it, Italy is in pretty bad shape at the moment. According to Tito Boeri's statistics, GDP per capita has returned to its 1989 levels. The size of the Italian public debt shows no sign of declining. Transparency International, the global anti-corruption civil society organization, has steadily mapped Italy's slippage down their international corruption charts. In 2013, the most recent statistics, it will come as no surprise to you that Denmark and New Zealand are in the first place. This is for records of no corruption, and I'm afraid Italy is 69th. It was 39th in 2000, so it's gone a long way down since then. And it's worse than Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and just better than Kuwait and Romania, to give you an idea. Italy's public administration, one of the worst in Europe, shows no signs of increasing efficiency. Universities and schools are terribly run down as spending has steadily decreased, leading to a totally demoralized workforce in the educational institutions of the country. Youth unemployment is at a dangerously high level. Criminal organizations flourish in the north as well as the south. The political parties manage to garner just 4% of citizens' trusts. It's the lowest ever. And the southern problem is as structurally serious as ever. And finally, Italy's legal system is quite unable to ensure justice. The number of levels of passage are too many, and the time taken to pass from one to another is too many. And then the statute of limitation comes into being. There have been some terrible examples of that just very recently. So faced with all this, and it's a lot, many commentators of both left and right are predicting catastrophe, imminent catastrophe. In the realm of public opinion, the depression over Italy's future is everywhere to be found. This phenomenon cannot be called a national anthem, but it is certainly a national lament. It is now to be heard at the beginning of every Italian day, first in the bar, then in the office, on television, in the streets and on the trains, inside families and outside of them. The lament is always the same, that Italy is down the drain. And indeed, one can imagine that it would be good to put that to music in one of those very slow and long Verdi choruses. Not Va Pensiero, which we know too well, but some other one that in some way conveys this long denunciation of themselves. But be careful, this is not new. Back in 1839, Carlo Cattaneo, one of the great figures of the Risorgimento, one of the great voices, the leader of the Milanese Revolution of 1848-49, academic, economist, extraordinary figure. He wrote of what he called that exquisitely Italian vice of always speaking badly of one's own country. And he went on to say that this could be attributed to an excess, an evanescenza of love for Italy, that because they loved it so much, they had to speak badly of it. Well, that may or may not be the case, but there's no doubt that the population, I think uniquely in Europe, speaks very badly about itself and its situation. In January 2009, I became an Italian citizen, to the general astonishment of my Italian friends, who said, "Why Italy and why now?" And the most caustic of them commented, "Well, Paul, at least now you'll be able to join us all in saying, 'I'm ashamed to be Italian.'" Mi vergogno di essere italiano. Well, This evening, I'd like to turn things on their head as far as possible and to take my distance from this national lament. I'd like to counteract the repetitive stereotype discourses of gloom and catastrophe, it's a nation of Cassandras, and offer a less unidirectional point of view, but I hope one firmly based in historical reality. So I'm trying to not adopt, accept the stereotype and see how far one can go in another direction, because that may lead us to have a slightly modified view of what's going on. Two preliminary remarks. First, that over time, and it's rather a lot of time by now, 66 years to be exact, the Italian Republic has shown a remarkable capacity to survive. We have to take that on board. It's one of the longest lasting republics in Europe or in the world. And I think we need to explain that fact, the fact that it hasn't just collapsed, as much as we should take into consideration other more habitual denunciations of what a terrible state it's in. Why has it survived so long, I think, is a good question. And secondly, we ought to note that there have been other, more dangerous moments for the survival of the Republic. And they're quite a lot, and they're certainly worse than the pickle we're in at the moment. For instance, the early 1970s, with inflation over 20%, widespread social unrest, left-wing leaders and trade unionists no longer sleeping at home because of a fear of a coup, the secret services up to no good at all. A pretty bad moment. Another one, Aldo Moro's assassination and the long season of terrorism, both left and right. Another still, the offensive of the most aggressive of the Sicilian mafia clans, the Corleonese, which culminated in the deaths of two wonderful magistrates, Falcone and Borsellino, in May and July of 1992. There they are. With Borsellino's funeral of the 21st of July 1992, certainly a moment, I think, much more than today, when the state actually trembled. Finally, amongst this list of bad moments, seriously bad moments, I would include Silvio Berlusconi's very comfortable victory in both houses of Parliament in April 2008, which seemed to herald the end of constitutional democracy as we have known it in Italy. Fortunately, he blew it and quarrelled with all his mates, but he had big majority to do what he wanted. So, to put it simply, these two preliminary remarks about the Republic has got an extraordinary longevity, 66 years, and secondly, that it's been in worse scrapes before now. And so I'd like you to take those into consideration. I'd now like to move on to the historical context. Let me go back in time and introduce some structural elements from the past, because I think that's the only way, at least it's the only way I am able to see how to value the present, how to see what it holds. And the first is a geographical and cultural point about Italy. We can understand little about that country if we don't recognize how much it is a Catholic and a Mediterranean country. Rome is the only city in Europe, I think in the world, which is the capital of two states. That is the Vatican City and the Italian Republic, and they're both there. The road between them is very short, and somebody like Giulio Andreotti very often walked down that street, often accompanied by a cardinal or two. The Vatican has always mattered very much in Italian politics. The Italian population may be less religious than it was, but the Vatican really, really matters. Secondly, as the anthropologist John Davis has remarked, it's difficult to identify omnipresent elements of Mediterraneità. But there is no doubt that patron-client relations, vertical dyadic relations, have been and still are of enormous importance in the way that Southern European societies and politics function. Very often, the idea that the real way in which Italy functioned was through clientels has been indignantly denied, but they're always there, and as we'll see, they've been reinforced since 2008. And also always there, and of tremendous importance in the European Mediterranean countries, is the family. And that's my speciality over these years. I've always tried to study the Italian family. Now in that book that's outside, I'm trying to look not only at Italy but other countries as well. And Peter Nichols, who was the veteran correspondent of the Times, wonderful journalist, and I'm happy to be able to quote him here, where back in 1973 described the family as, I quote, the accredited masterpiece of Italian society over the centuries, the semi-sacred group, the avenger and the rewarder. And anybody who either lives in an Italian family or has stayed in an Italian family will know exactly what he meant. And that's as true today as it was then. And it's worth, on a more academic basis, noting that only in Italy has there been a major debate on familism as a concept. You don't find that in Spain, you don't find it in Greece. And that is the tendency, familism, not just to place family interests first, nearly all of us do that, but to the exclusion of all other collective and public interests. Familism is very introverted as far as the family is concerned, which doesn't relate to the society or the state. So a country that is quintessentially Catholic and Mediterranean, obviously I can only telegraphically point to these things because of time, but I think that's the first long-term structural point that I want to make. That's the sort of country it is. Primary social groupings, i.e. families, very much to the fore. Vertical solidarities of clientele, also very much to the fore. The second element of historical context of the longue durée is Italy's configuration in what the historian Edward Thompson once called the great arch of bourgeois revolution. The great arch of bourgeois revolution. That is, the long-term affirmation of capitalism in any given country and the stable creation therein of the institutions and practices of liberal democracy. So the development of capitalism and the corresponding, that's a loaded term, I don't know how corresponding it really is, but the simultaneous and more or less simultaneous development of liberal institutions and democracy. Obviously, the first of these defining elements, the Catholic and the Mediterranean, has a moulding influence upon the second, Italy's version of this great arch of bourgeois transformation. And we have to ask, how does Italy fare over the long term in relation to that great arch? Well, I think there are some extraordinary economic and social achievements, and we should pay tribute to them, as well as not forgetting all the things I said at the beginning of the lecture. I think the economic miracle, Italy's economic miracle, broad-based 1958 to 63, is a very extraordinary time for the country. It revolutionizes its population. Millions of people change their place of residence. It's a time when the lira wins the Economist Prize for the soundest money in Europe. It seems a long ago time, but it was there and it lasted a long time, and it's the basis of Italy's wealth. And still we have to remember that Italy has the second largest industrial base in the European Union. It's not a little country economically. And it still has, I checked up on them, very respectable figures for commercial exports. WTO figures show that Italy is regularly in 8th or 9th place. So that's interesting, and one could say that there are some social achievements as well, not only economic ones. In particular, I'd say, the creation of a welfare state, which came late in Italy, which was certainly part of a Mediterranean model in the sense of being clientelistic, particularist, family dependent, told families to look after lots of patients, but which offered the centre and the north of the country in particular, though not the south, a highly successful national health service. Still today, if you have to get ill in Tuscany or Emilia-Romagna or the Veneto or Lombardy, because there's a pretty good chance that you'll get better treatment than you will in Britain. So these are just some remarks to say, let's look at the long term, let's see what sort of country this is, let's see certainly some negative aspects which are very much to the fore at the moment, but let's see some fairly solid bases that might go some way into explaining why the Republic has survived. And for the last of these elements of the Great Arch, I want to just talk very quickly about politics. In politics, Italy has been much more fragile than it has been, I think, in economics. Norberto Bobbio, who is Italy's greatest post-war political philosopher, described the history of the country as made up of small revolutions and long counter-revolutions. And it's a very sharp way of looking at it. And when he had what he had in mind for the small revolutions was certainly the Risorgimento, and also, it has to be said, the resistance of 1943 to 1945. Those were moments when that part of Italy dreamt of different possibilities and things. Out of 1943 to 45 came the Republican Constitution of the 1st of January 1948, the constitution that all the politicians hate and want to change, and which Italian civil society, by and large, has fought back and prevented up to now. So there are these moments of hope and transformation, but we can't forget that Italy exported fascism to the world. And beyond that, I think we should say that it's not only a question of fascism, but that the long Italian tradition, there have been Roman dictators. Garibaldi was a dictator. Their concept of the term in the South in 1860, there's a concept of the term changes. They're not dictators in Mussolini's way, but all the opinion polls show that if you say, does Italy need a strong charismatic figure to lead it? And the answer is yes, 72%, something like that. So if we look at the longue durée, we see obviously a mixed legacy. We don't see it going in one direction, we see it going in others with light and with shade. That might be true of nearly every democratic country that has taken part in the Great Arch. We might point to strengths, many economic ones, in the centre and north of the country, and we should certainly point to its weaknesses, with fascism in the forefront. Now let me move to look at the effects of the great economic crisis of 2008 onwards. And go back to the Catholic and the Mediterranean, and immediately to say that an extraordinary voice has made itself heard against all expectations, questioning the logic of the present economic system, stressing the need for widespread social reform and social solidarity, and for transparent and enlightened government. When Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, stood down on the 11th of February 2011, none of the expert Vatican watchers predicted the election of a radical pope. There wasn't one of them who said that. On the contrary, in the light of the conservative choices of new cardinals made by John Paul II during his long reign, they expected the opposite, somebody very much with the same values as John Paul II. And indeed, there was a very strong Italian lobby going for a very conservative pope. They lost to a sort of global coalition that wanted change after scandal after scandal. And what they got, unwittingly, I think, was the most iconoclastic and innovative pope since Pope John the 23rd, 1958, 1963. And he may well be much more innovative than John. Here he is doing one of his typical things. This was very, very early when he came to take up the papacy. And you can imagine these are immigrants, illegal immigrants who have been condemned criminally. And it's an extraordinary gesture. Another gesture which was very much commented upon was the first voyage outside, going outside the Vatican. Was the very first thing he did was to go down to Lampedusa in the far south, get in a boat and throw a wreath into the water to commemorate the thousands of lives that have been lost in that stretch of water between Tripoli and Lampedusa. And he said, let it never happen again, and it goes on happening. Hardly a month goes by without some pronouncement or exhortation of the Pope, which astonishes and to a great extent delights Italian and global Catholic opinion, and not only Catholic opinion, Italian public opinion in general. And because the Vatican is so important, let me take just one document, leaving aside reluctantly the very recent and very interesting Synod on the Family, where he was forcing the cardinals to vote openly, 27 against 74, whether they were in favour of all sorts of things. And anyway, let me take the first of Pope Bergoglio's pontificate, the 200 pages of Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, of November 2013. Francis urges Catholics to spread the word of Christ as a joyous activity, so the Church grows not from proselytism, I'm sure that's not the right pronunciation in English, but by attraction. He invites the faithful to be audacious and creative. And he goes on, I repeat here what I have said many times to the priests of Buenos Aires. I prefer a church troubled, wounded, and dirty, but which has taken to the streets, rather than a church made sick by its closures and by the convenience of clinging on to a few certainties. However, it's chapter 2 that is the most remarkable. Just one quote, point 53. I quote again. Just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, establishes a clear limit in order to ensure the value of human life, so today we must say no to an economy based on exclusion and inequality. This economy kills people. It treats human beings as if they were commodities that can be used and then thrown away. There's no pope that said that before. So that weighs in a Catholic and Mediterranean country. That's important, and my cynical friends say, well, they'll soon get rid of him. And there will be one of those things that Italians love to speculate about, a conspiracy. And the conspiracy will give him a poisoned cup of coffee or something. Let's hope it doesn't happen. And let's hope he goes on, because this is an extraordinary voice for Italy, but not only for Italy. What else has been happening? Well, I want to talk about the question of families, because I think it's very interesting to try and reckon. There hasn't been a great deal of research, it's all very recent, to see what has been happening to families since 2008. because families, even more than in the past, have been called in to cope in first person with the social dramas and needs arising from youth unemployment, adverse labour markets, and reduction in welfare expenditure. Figures for healthcare in the period 2009-2012 show that per capita public expenditure on healthcare in Italy registered an annual average decline of 2.4%. This was considerable if you take it, what that means in terms of services. But it's much less than in Spain, minus 4.3%, let alone Portugal, minus 7.9%, or Greece, minus 11.8%. So Italy is suffering, but it's certainly not suffering at the level of Portugal or Greece. But in this situation, families have had to develop strategies where they have 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds who have no jobs and have no money and who have to live at home. And they survive as best they can with recourse to a grandfather's pension or the money coming in from part-time work from a mother. They work out strategies to make families the hub of resistance, passive resistance, obviously, but resistance to what's happening outside of their homes. Families are closing ranks, coping as best they can. And women, it's very interesting, continue to have a small number of children. Fertility rates stand at 1.3 children per woman in childbearing age. And that's exactly the same, 1.3, as in 1992. And there's been a huge influx of immigrant women having children. And nonetheless, the overall average is only 1.3, which suggests very, very strongly that Italian women are having very few children indeed. And they're also postponing maternity, especially those in the south, especially those on temporary work contracts. So overall, the picture is of small, long families, three-generational, coping as only they can, but with their savings almost completely eaten away now, and in a society that is increasingly gerontocratic. So families are up against it. Families are a safety valve of extraordinary importance in Italy during the crisis. But they're in dire trouble. And here, truly, we can say, we don't know how long it's going to go on before families cannot cope on a massive scale. Still sticking with Catholic, Mediterranean, family, and clientelas, the crisis has brutally reinforced familism and clientelism, those time-honoured social mechanisms of Italian society, which I mentioned at the beginning. In some regions, the clan and the clientelistic group, sometimes criminal, sometimes not, have become the best or the only way of coping, the only way of joining a clientelistic ladder and getting on it in order to get some work. The situation is most dramatic in the south. The power of southern patrons is paramount, and godfathering is still widespread. In the 1940s and 1950s, southern patrons still had gold teeth and large rings, and the top button of their voluminous trousers was left unbuttoned to make room for their considerable girth. I looked very hard, I couldn't find somebody with a really, really big tummy like I wanted to. But in terms of a man on the make, and would you trust him? I wouldn't, but many people don't have any option. Today, these same patrons, who have much the same values of 50 or 60 years ago, wear exquisitely tailored suits, are suave, university educated, they're consultants in hospitals, they're politicians, they are expert wheelers and dealers, and clientelism lives a new glorious period, and the horizontal relations of citizenship are rarely seen. Let me turn to politics in this particular conjuncture. to that which I would like to call the populist playground, or perhaps in Italian, the Luna Park. It's quite a scene, Italian politics at the moment. The first thing to note, and I think it's very important with respect to the past, is there has been a real sea change in the question of charismatic leadership. The early decades of the Republic bore the memories and scars of the fascist experience. As a result, the post-war generation of Christian Democrats were very wary of overpowerful leaders, even within their own party. Indeed, above all, within their own party. The classic examples of preventive action concern first Amintore Fanfani in January 1959, and then Ciriaco de Mita in May 1989. In both these cases, these very powerful politicians were defenestrated by their colleagues after having briefly occupied simultaneously the posts of party secretary and prime minister. It was just not on. Well, Matteo Renzi is both party secretary and prime minister today, and nobody seems to object. And any shreds of reserve have been discarded in the last 20 years, and we are confronted with what can be called a new populist playground. I'd like just to show you some of the people on rides. Here's Beppe Grillo of the Cinque Stelle in a nice round boat, telling everybody to andare faffanculo. Charming and helpful. Matteo Renzi on his bicycle. Matteo Salvini, who many of you may not know, and the new leader of the Lega Nord, and one to watch with horror. He's a very clever, much cleverer than Bossi. He's a racist. He's in touch with the extreme right-wing neo-Nazi groups, and he's growing a percentage point per week in popularity. He's in this extraordinary European turmoil with these figures coming through very, very fast. He's one of the fastest movers. All of them are advocates of increased power for single charismatic figures within the Italian political system, the destruction of Republican constitutionalism, and they have many features in common. Renzi, Berlusconi, and Salvini believe in the impelling need to curb judicial autonomy. They think that the judges are too powerful and that they must, although they're in different degrees, they think they must be reined in before it's too late. Berlusconi and Grillo own their own parties outright and have a nasty tendency to expel all dissenters. The case of Beppe Grillo is extraordinary. Only Renzi's party, the PD, have some sort of internal democracy at work with the introduction of primaries, but they are a fragile construction, constantly under threat from the leadership. So I'd like to talk for a moment about Berlusconismo. It would be I think one has to say that 20 years of Berlusconi, he wasn't always in power, but he was for a long time. What have been and still are the distinguishing characteristics of Berlusconismo? I'd like to say immediately that this is new. I mean, that this is not to be found in the past. I think he's an extraordinary figure as an innovator. I mean, an evil innovator, but certainly an innovator. First of all, a strong emphasis on negative freedom, the freedom from of Isaiah Berlin, the freedom to do what he wants without intervention from the state. Secondly, the control of the media. And thirdly, clan attitudes to Italian society. Eugenio Scalfari said on one occasion that Berlusconi would love Italy to be the whole of Italy to be his clan, because he basically wants to be loved and he basically wants to give out gifts and favors, and it's a very neo-patrimonial view of political leadership. And but I'd like to put the emphasis, as time marches on cultural models of Berlusconism because I think it's very interesting. He comes up with a particular cultural model of populism, heavily influenced by American television of the 1980s. There's lots of trash and kitsch, and I'd like to show you just 3 objects which sort of symbolize parts of this complicated culture. First of all, the present that Berlusconi gave, oh, there he is, sorry, just in his own right, on a good day. Here, just 3 objects. Let's go again. The present that Berlusconi gave to each head of state at the G8 held at L'Aquila after the earthquake in July 2009. And this is a volume, if such it can be called, dedicated to the great neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova. All the pages were handmade. The cover is in Carrara marble, and each volume weighs 25 kilograms. Obama, who's in the picture, said it was too heavy to put in his luggage, while the Canadian Prime Minister said it was against Canadian law to accept such a gift. And you can imagine Berlusconi's astonishment at such a statement. I mean, he'd never heard any, well, what's that all about? So that's the first, a sort of thing that exaggerates horribly and is totally unusable. And is. Here's the second, his famous bandana, and you might recognize the people who are accompanying him. There we are, we're in the summer of 2004, we're on the Costa Smeralda. Tony Blair and his wife have come to Berlusconi's villa in Sardinia. And Mrs. Blair has recounted later that, to a newspaper, that Tony had said to her that evening in bed, for God's sake, tomorrow make sure that you're always standing between me and Berlusconi. Otherwise, the British press will massacre me. So she was always in the middle, poor woman. The last one, to comment on obliquely on a different area, cultural populism, I don't know if that's the right word, but here he is with Noemi Letizia, aged 18, who called him Papi. And he suddenly turned up as president of the Council of Ministers to her birthday party. And she has the signed letter and a photograph all in that nice container. And that just to symbolize at a delicate level the sort of sexual innuendo that was always there, sometimes implicit, but above all explicit in the vision that he was offering. Well, I move on, and I'm nearly through, to Renzi and Berlusconi. I think a lightning comparison may be in order. Berlusconi's heroine was always Margaret Thatcher. He loved her until she fell from power. And Renzi's is Tony Blair. He thinks he's wonderful. On gender issues, Berlusconi is marked out by priapic excess. Renzi promotes a Catholic and Boy Scout image and pushes hard for numerical gender parity, but it's only numerical. The Renziane, the women ministers, all very young and inexperienced, have very little autonomy from their leader, who literally dictates the line word by word. Both Renzi and Berlusconi are very good at making promises and very bad at keeping them. Both would be anxious to be seen in the company of cardinals, who never balked at appearing at Berlusconi's side. And Renzi is intent on carrying through the major parts of Berlusconi's old programme for government, the destruction of the anti-fascist constitution, increased flexibility in the labour market, the destruction of the balance of powers within the state. The two men meet often, but it's striking that Renzi avoids at all costs having his picture taken with Berlusconi. They meet, it's said that they meet, but he's too ashamed, or too something or other, or the political calculus is there. He just cannot yet be seen hand in arm with Silvio. So, one last point, and then I wanted to talk about Europe, but perhaps I can talk about Europe during question time. I want to mention something that Andrew raised at the start, and it's in the face of that really depressing scenario of political populism, the rides and everything else, and the link between Renzi and Berlusconi. It is true that Italian civil society over the last 10-15 years has been able to fight back, has grown, and did reach an extraordinary peak in 2002, 2003, when Nanni Moretti was speaking to huge crowds practically every week. He's the famous Italian film director, I'm sure you know him. And it was an exhilarating, extraordinary moment when it looked as if the politicians would have to listen, which they didn't. And there have been many organizations like Libertà e Giustizia, which takes its name from the resistance and has fought through a referendum, won a referendum in defense of the Constitution, and others that I don't have time to mention. There is the Popolo Viola. There has been, and even at a micro level, there have been a great deal of counter-narratives going on at local levels, even at street levels, in society as a whole. Civil society has been very quiet over the last 18 months, but that's the way these things work. They disappear and then they come back again. What civil society has been unable to do is come up with any form of politics, which a political party or great movement. And this has happened both in Spain with Podemos and in Greece with Tsipras. Both of them, the latest polls are well over 25%. And the Italians have never got further than 4% recently. So there is a problem there of the translation of civil society activity in the streets, in the circles and all the rest, into a political force, and that doesn't happen. So my conclusions. I come back to the sort of questions that I was asking at the beginning. Why has Italy survived and continues to do so? Well, there's a very fine voice, which is that of Gustavo Zagrebelsky, who was the president of the Constitutional Court and has been the president of Libertà e Giustizia, Libertà e Giustizia. And Zagrebelsky has fought very hard to change things and lost all down the line. And he writes recently that Italy is a tragic republic for the many people who've been killed, for the impossibility for something new to be expressed. And he says that if the republic has survived as long as it has, then that's only because the subversive forces and interests in society haven't got their act together. They've either split, like Berlusconi and Fini in 2008, or they've been denounced, or for various reasons, he thinks that Italy, there's just not, for the moment, a sufficient coordination of anti-democratic forces, but that probably it will become. There's something in that, but I don't really agree with it. I think the underlying reason lies with all that I've been trying to say this evening in terms of conflicting processes taking place in Italian society, of many things that are very black and some things that are very positive and continue to be important. And I'd like to end by talking personally about the city of Reggio Calabria, where I went 2 weeks ago to receive a little literary prize. Reggio Calabria is one of the most the poorest and one of the most criminal-ridden cities in Italy, and the 'Ndrangheta is very strong. The city is built very badly after the earthquake of 1907. It's in many ways a grim place, only saved by looking over the water to Messina and Etna. And as part of this prize, they asked me to go and speak in a liceo scientifico, the Liceo Scientifico Leonardo da Vinci, the science lycée of the city. And I've done these things quite often, going to talk in schools, and they had the task, as it was a literary prize, of reading some of my new book and commenting upon it. And I went, I must say, a little cynically. I thought, well, they won't have read it and they won't be very interested, and there'll be quite a lot of background noise and I'll have to struggle through. And this liceo has 2,200 students. It has a preside, a director, a woman aged 40. The preparation given to my book was something that I'd never seen before. There are 150 students in the Aula Magna, and they'd all read different chapters, and some of them read the whole book. And they asked question after question, and I was just amazed in my northern ignorance. And I thought, well, Italy is a strange place, and it has these unbelievable moments of just sort of seem to offer in a kernel something that could be and somehow never is. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, for a wonderful survey of the history and context of contemporary Italian politics. Can I open it for questions? We'll yeah, Robert, please.
Robert
There's a microphone if you'd like it.
Thank you. Robert from the Constitution Unit at University College London. Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I'm going to ask a constitutional question, if I may, about the judiciary and the justice system. You mentioned right at the beginning the terrible delays, the many levels in the system, and the many opportunities for appeal. And forgive me, I'm seriously ignorant about the judicial system, so this may be based on a false premise. But I think my understanding is that the judiciary have a high degree of autonomy, in particular over judicial appointments, which are done by the higher council of the magistracy.
That's absolutely.
And so my question is, we know about Berlusconi's reforms and how they were essentially self-interested, but if there is political will under the new government to try to reform the justice system, to reduce the delays, possibly to reduce some of the tiers and levels of appeal, etc., what levers, if any, have the politicians, the government or the parliament got over the justice system if the judiciary, and again I'm making an assumption, are essentially conservative and resistant to reform?
Well, the short answer is that they have considerable possibilities for reforming the system, and they are actively doing it at the moment, changing the composition of the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura, the CSM, which is the governing body of the judges, and both magistrates and judges, and we can come on to that. And that is already now, bit by bit, and again, it's both Berlusconi and Renzi, which is one of the disconcerting things about this moment. They both want to have more politicians on the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura so that they can rein it in, and through that limit the autonomy of the magistrates. It has to be said, and I'd be the first to say it, that the magistrates themselves have done themselves no favours in being quite vulnerable on a series of issues. Their income, the number of days worked in some of the procure, and sometimes quite high-handed action, particularly 20 or 30 years ago, of putting people in prison and leaving them there for up to 6 months, which doesn't have much to do with our ideas of habeas corpus. So I think there's already a process underway to undermine this autonomy, but I would, in spite of the failings and short-sightedness of magistrates, I think on a number of issues, I would, and also to criticise them on things where they got things wrong, I would say that they have, without any doubt at all, in this very peculiar situation, which is Italian political and constitutional issues, they have been, well, heroes, both in their anti-corruption struggles and above all in their anti-mafia struggles. And that was only possible because they were a self-governing corporation within the structure of the Italian state. So you'd find somebody like Zagrebelski, who's very, who was president of the Constitutional Court, quite critical of the judges, but recognizing their extraordinary contribution to answering that question, how's it gone on 66 years? And I think it has, because a lot of people have identified with them, particularly with those two, Falcone and Borsellino, who were blown up by the mafia. So I think one must be judicious, and I perhaps haven't answered you in detail, but in broad terms, I would go very slowly on reform, but unfortunately the politicians are not going slowly, and I think that's bad news. I think they're reforming for all the wrong reasons as far as the CSM is concerned. And I'm very willing to give Renzi the benefit of doubt over the question of reforming the times between, the time it takes to get to the first level, the time it takes to get to the second, then the third, the Cassazione, and the Cassazione can send it all back to the beginning to start again. And it, justice never happens, as I said in the lecture, it's statute of limitation. So if Renzi really reduces the number of days, in my book I got all the statistics, at least for the beginning of the 2000, it's something like 709 days to get to the first levels. If he does anything there, then hooray. But lots of people have said over the past that that's what they're going to do. And it's quite intractable. It's a really difficult situation, which you won't solve merely by cutting. And that's, in all public institutions, government has been characterized by the lack of investment. And judges and magistrates simply reply, we could do things faster if we didn't have to work on 1950s typewriters, for instance.
Next question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I want to raise...
There's a microphone coming. So. Perhaps if everyone would say who they are, it would
I was waiting a few seconds for the students to ask questions, but
they'll come later.
Failing the students, okay. Then... I wanted to raise the question of corruption. Its origins. You referred to Southern Europe, and undoubtedly the levels of corruption across Southern Europe are very high. And the traditional discourse is, of course, this is to do with Protestantism and Catholicism. But I would argue that's not the case. And actually, again, I'm asking a typical historian's question. In terms of long periods of history, would you say that the analysis that points to a weak state in a slowly modernizing economy is actually key to understanding corruption in the present? A weak state which is not able to establish the kind of social cohesion and the legitimacy of states that have modernized over 200 years, and that the same dispersal of interests, the same existence of intermediaries across society has impeded that sense of an individual responsibility towards the state, hence giving rise to these networks of corruption. So it's a long question.
No. Perhaps you should just say who you are as well.
Oh, sorry. Sebastian Balfour, London School of Economics.
Well, Sebastian, thank you for that one. And I very broadly agree with it. And I do think it's important, and I believe, as you do, I think, in trying to isolate certain moments in the last 200 years when history could have gone in a different direction. It didn't, but that doesn't mean we have to stop looking at what sort of direction it went in, and what sort of direction it could have gone in, and also link that to Bobbio and the idea of short revolutions and then long counter-revolutions. And as far as the state goes, I'm very struck by two moments when things could have been different. And that was, the first one is after the unification of Italy. And I think we're in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and we're quite close to the Northcote Trevelyan reforms in Britain, which are fundamental for not having a weak state, having some form of meritocratic state. And we're also, in France with Jules Ferry and others, moving towards a strong French state, or reinforcing the strong French state. And the sinistra storica is just not up to the task. And this is really fascinating about the weakness of the recurring weaknesses of the sinistra storica, not only then, but then later, to really make the difference. So one has to be careful. One used to talk about not making the Weberian leap. And then various people said they didn't like the idea of the Weberian leap at all, and that nobody had made the Weberian leap. But at least, even if the level was down there, at least if they jumped over that little obstacle, and they don't, and you have to look for the moments where history could have turned and didn't, and that's one of them. And the second, which is even more extraordinary, is after the resistance and during the moment when the public administration no longer exists, 1944 and 1945. There's a bit at Salò with Mussolini. There's a bit in Rome, hiding away. There's a bit that's fled to be to the south, to relatives. That there is no state. The state, when the king escaped from Rome in 1943, was two typewriters and a jeep. And that's really extraordinary. And so in that moment where there is no state, then that could have been a moment of grand reform. And I've read the Verbali del Consiglio dei Ministri, the records of the debates in the Council of Ministers, 1944, 1945. And they mention it 3 times with a paragraph each and nothing more. So it's a cultural weakness. They haven't put it on the agenda. The agenda is the debate on the Constitution, which is really important to all of them. But reforming the public administration on new bases, no sign. Because later on it becomes terribly difficult to do. The trade unions are in there, you're protecting jobs, so again, forgive me saying this, Renzi puts a very beautiful woman into the role of the Minister for the Reform of the public administration, and he says, I will have the reform on the 28th of July or 28th of September or whatever, and we get there and it's a nightmare. There's nothing there. There are a few notes and it goes to the Corte dei Conti and they pick it up and they say, what's this, the reform of the public administration? So, I don't know. We'll see.
Yes, please. Yeah, and then there's one over. Lots of hands now. So.
Thank you. John Strafford. What is the relationship of Italy to the European Union? And has it got any future other than as a part of a United States of Europe within the Eurozone? Or is it going to take orders from Germany?
To answer that, if I can find it, there was another. What have I done with the key? Perhaps if I just go downwards, it would work. Very good. That's an answer. There's Mario Draghi desperately trying to bail out the sinking ship. There's Matteo Renzi eating an ice cream. And there's the leadership of Europe looking ahead. I don't think Italy has any future at all outside of the European Union. I am absolutely convinced, and we have to remember that Italy, up to 5 years ago, consistently had the strongest percentage of the population totally in favour of European Union. And that doesn't, now the numbers have declined, as they've all declined, as it's been identified as, the element that is responsible for the conditions of families and all the rest. But I don't think that very long-term allegiance to the Union is going to go away. And I don't think the forces in the country, differently from Britain, really want that. There are some. Beppe Grillo waxes hot and cold as to whether he wants a referendum on Europe. And Matteo Salvini definitely doesn't wants Italy out of Europe, but there's no majority for that at the moment. And I personally think that Italy's role in Europe has improved over the last 15, 20 years. Italy used to be the sort of country that always wanted a seat at a conference table or a committee or something like that. And when the others gave in and gave them a seat, they never turned up. I mean, absolutely. That's not, I'm not just making it up. They're very, very marked, not only with that sort of thing, but also with the regular attendance of members of European Parliament. Consistently, the Italians have been the worst, the ones most known for absenteeism. And another example from the old days, a politician called Malfatti, who became the only Italian president of the Commission in 1972, he retired because he said, after 2 years, because he said he found Rome to be more congenial, and he wanted to go on with his career there. And so Italy, let's say from 1957 right through the 70s, is a real bit player in Europe. And then when we get to 1992 and it's thrown out of the monetary union, and so is Britain, and things look very gloomy indeed, and the Germans make it quite clear they'd rather have a two-tier level for the future. And the German finance minister says if Italy ever gets into the euro band, I'll eat my hat. You know, there's a tremendous feeling that it's not, and the Financial Times, you know, waxes lyrical about the need to keep Italy out. And then things change, and it's very interesting to see who changes them. There's a young Mario Draghi at the Treasury. There's the late lamented Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, who was one of the architects of the Maastricht Agreement. There was Carlo Azeglio Ciampi, a very expert banker. And there was Prodi, who in 1996 to 1998 pushed very, very hard for Europe and won against great suspicion from the Germans. And so, and he established the euro tax. We all have to pay for Europe, and everybody did. And he actually managed to give some of it back afterwards. So Italy, and I think that the Italian personnel at Brussels also has changed very considerably. And there is, you know, we may say what we want about his politics, but the fact that Mario Draghi is there and he's so good at his job is a tremendous boost for Italy in the Union as a whole, because they haven't had a figure like that. Prodi was the president of the Commission, but he wasn't a very successful one, unfortunately. But Mario Draghi is pretty impressive. Indeed, the Financial Times, always so skeptical, voted him Man of the Year last year.
Yes, there's a question over here.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. So I'm Italian, but I work for the UK Government Economic Service, so it's really interesting to see.
What do you work for?
For the UK government as an economist. So
Yeah.
I would just wanted to add a few ingredients to the picture of Italy that you painted.
Thank
Something
you.
that has come up from my point of view as an Italian from abroad. So clearly a big brain drain of the youth.
Yeah.
Clearly it touches me personally, but is much broader in this.
Clearly a brain drain, and what was the one after that? Sorry.
The brain drain, and then another point around the lack of skilled, incompetent politicians. So in the past in Italy, politicians would have been formed through party schools, which have increasingly gone down.
Absolutely right.
And so, and it's different from the UK, where maybe elitist but very prestigious schools tend to prepare politicians. And then something else that has changed from my point of view is the rise of prestige of entrepreneurs that have become a point of reference rather than intellectuals. And then I'm not sure about how the technological gap worked in Italy in the past, but to me it's very clear that today we're much behind compared to other European states in terms of access to internet and the technological, as you would have said, even within the public services. So the availability of big data and how that is being used. So I'm not so sure how positive I would feel, because all of these point to me at a bit of a backward set of the state that should potentially need to rely on families that are being taken apart. And I'm not so sure about how we should rely on religion as the engine to bring our country forward, because it should be a secularized economy rather than a religious one.
Thank you very much. It's very useful. Every single point adds to the dark picture, and I totally understand and indeed very warmly sympathise with, you know, the situation of Italian youth, which may have enormous educational capital, but absolutely no jobs, or even you know, just stuck, paralysed at home. And when people go, quite often there's, I won't say a flippant attitude, but certainly an underestimation of the degree of wrenching that is required to come to Berlin or Paris or London, and the tens of thousands of youth who have made those choices. And some, the brightest, go zooming up, but many just stay after 5 years now, or even 10, as cooks, as waiters. working in pubs, doing very part-time menial jobs. And it's, what can one say? Zagrebelsky is right, that's tragic. And what's really tragic from Italy's point of view is it's trained all these people, it sent them through the Liceo Classico, like the one in Reggio, and then it offers them nothing. So that's very right, and it's very depressing. But I still stick to my guns about that it's not all like that, and that there are other elements that are very, and not just the voice of the Pope, that lead us to look for a way forward, and to base that way forward on the paths of history, not just on the contingency and conjuncture, but to see where Italy has been strong in the past, and it has been in some places, and it still is today in others.
Right. I'll take a group of questions together because, so please, first.
Mine is a somewhat lighter question. Does Italy have a Minister of Tourism? Because if they do, I think they're failing on their job. Because for the last 3 years in October, we've been on holiday in Puglia, in Minturno and Sardinia, and so many hotels and restaurants and everything is closed, and you have this wonderful weather, wonderful facilities, and we discovered this palace near Naples, which resembles Versailles, and we discovered it with great difficulty. When we went to Garibaldi's home, we were the only people going around it. We were not allowed to take a photograph. There's nowhere selling photographs at the end of it. There's a restaurant. They took one look at us and closed it, although it was supposed to be open. I mean, Italy has such wonderful opportunities. And if I was the Minister of Tourism, I'd get everybody going there. EasyJet's got cheap flights. Come on, Italy.
Very good.
Right, we take another question at the back. Please, thanks.
Carl Levy, Goldsmiths College. Paul, in your first volumes of the history of Italy, there's this dialectic, or you still do it, I think, in your life and work, but it's different now since in the last 20 years. And the dialectic is between social movements, social mobilization, 1940s, 1968, 69, and then, of course, 1992 or 89 to 92, if you include Palermo Spring and all of that. And then, of course, your own involvement 10 years after that. I mean, the missing hand, of course, is the Communist Party, or some massive party of the left, which would be the repository of this historical movement. And I'm just wondering if you could just reflect on the failure of, the children of Berlinguer, I suppose, when it comes down to it, in the last 20 years, maybe their grandchildren, I suppose. I don't know what Berlinguer would have thought of somebody like Matteo Renzi, but anyway, that's the question. The other one is about, you say judges, the other important actor are technocrats, and if you think about Berlusconi, his career and somehow is sandwiched in some ways between two technocratic governments, so that, it's a neat symmetry. So those are the two things I'm asking.
Okay. Is there some other last questions? Yes, please.
Hi there, I'm George Williams. I'm a student at Reading University. I was just wondering if you think there's any truth in the notion that the unification of Italy and the idea that perhaps it wasn't a truly national unification. Do you think in that has any way imposed a legacy upon Italy that many governments have often had difficulties? I just wondering your thoughts on that.
Okay. Over to you, Paul, for some last words.
I'd certainly vote for you as Minister of Tourism. I'm sorry to say, and without any disrespect, according to Matteo Renzi, you're quite the wrong age, and you should be rotomato. You should be like an old car, and so should I, and so should all of us of a certain age, because the future belongs to youth. It's full of contradictions, this position, because the Minister of Tourism is part of the, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the Ministry of the Beni Culturale. It's so that there isn't a single ministry dedicated to it, but it comes in with the evaluation and protection of monuments, etc., which they certainly don't do very well. And you're absolutely right, we can put it on our very long list of negative factors, and perhaps one day somebody will do something about it. Carl's question on social movements and the children of Berlinguer, I think that's a very good question, and it's a difficult one. Part of the lament, particularly in somewhere left-wing like Tuscany, is not just for Italy, but is for the party that they lost, the Communist Party. And I think it's really difficult to explain why the post-Berlinguer generations made such a muck of it. But they did, and I remember a debate with D'Alema, and he said, you know, nobody's interested in Gramsci anymore. You know, nobody's interested in communist culture anymore. This is a moment when Gramsci studies were sort of sweeping all over the world, and when the idea of hegemony and all the rest, and they just wanted to throw everything out. They were so anxious to come across as non-communists that they just threw the whole tradition out the window. Veltroni, D'Alema, Occhetto, perhaps a little less, but that was only because he lost power. And I don't know what the why they were so incompetent, and why I do know in a way, because post-89 you had to say you weren't a communist. You know, it was really crucially important in Italy that, and not only in Italy, that you weren't a communist. But even so, they could have, you know.
They lost their political confidence, whatever they call it.
They completely lost their political confidence, that's right. But they, about the unification of Italy, I think that's a very sound point. The way Italy was unified left a civil war in the south. But on the other hand, we have to say, well, what processes of national unification aren't based on violence and the destruction of minorities? I mean, very many of them, you know, are Great Britain to start with. And so in that process of unification, of state unification, etc., there is the figure of Garibaldi, and he is very extraordinary, and he should not be forgotten, I don't think. When he came to London after his great expedition to the south in 1864, 400,000 people turned out to welcome him. It was the largest demonstration in Victorian history, and he was with good reason, an idol not just of the Italian working classes, but of the British as well. And that, I think, would sort of confirm what I've been trying to say, that there are a tremendous, overwhelming number of negative points, but there are many conflictual processes and many figures who stand out and are part of a tradition that is worth something.
Well, on that note of hope, can I thank you very much, Paul, for a wonderful lecture and for a very good interaction with everyone that's come. There is now a reception, a wine reception, just out here, to which everybody is invited, and there'll be a chance to continue the discussion with Paul. But can I thank Paul very, very much for coming here and giving us his insights into Italian politics. Thank you, Paul.